Hello everyone, and welcome to my second of 3 videos on this, the Nikon D80. In the first video we talked about what everything on the camera is. In this video we'll talk about what everything does. To jump right in, this is a digital camera. It can do nothing whatsoever unless it has a charged battery in it. So to get to the battery, we're going to go to the underside of the camera here, push the lock mechanism back. You can see here, if I open the door this way, that little tab is all that's keeping this door closed. So you retract it, pull it open, and now you can pull out the battery. This uses a Nikon ENEL3E battery. There is a difference between the 3 and the 3E. If I grab this other camera that has a 3 in it, and I just learned this today by the way, you might notice that the 3 and the 3E have a different shape cut out in that little notch next to that silver contact, and this notch will fit in the D80. This notch will fit in the D70. The 3E will also fit in the D70, but the Nikon ENEL3 will not fit in the D80. So you need to have the ENEL3E for this camera. I don't think Nikon makes them anymore, so you're going to have to get them third party. To mount the battery, there's only one way they can go in. If you try to put it in the wrong way, you're not going to get very far. So this is pretty foolproof. But you simply put it in with the contacts facing into the camera in the one direction that this will fit. Push, shut the door. Now here's a motion to shut the door that you should have. Retract that latch into the door, push it shut, and then release. Because that latch is all that keeps this door shut, it would be a good idea to protect it. If that latch breaks, you'll have to take the bottom of the camera off to replace the door. You can get a replacement door, I would imagine, without great difficulty. But it is always better just to not have to do that than to break something and have to fix it. So now that we have a battery in the camera, let's talk about mounting and removing lenses. Here's the lens ring right here. This is where we're going to mount the lens. That white dot is your lens mounting index. That red dot is going to line up with it. On some Nikon lenses, they don't have an index, and you use the infinity focus point as your mounting index. Line them up, turn it counterclockwise until it clicks, and now you've mounted your lens. So this camera can use lenses that have a screw drive autofocus because it has a screw drive autofocus. That's one of the improvements this has over the entry-level tier of cameras from Nikon, is that this had that ability. So you can use AID lenses as well as the G series lenses, and it also does not have the meter coupling ring on it, which means you could use NAI and pre-AI lenses with some caveats. This camera is really not intended to do that, so we're not going to cover it in these videos. But if you are interested in using vintage lenses on this camera, it is a thing that you can do, and there are some good tutorials online that can help you learn how to do that if you have one of those lenses. Alright, so now that we have a battery and a lens, we're good to go and take photos, right? Well, not quite. We need a memory card first. The memory card slot is on this side right here. We open it up that way, and we can load memory cards by putting them with the sticker side toward the back of the camera, push them in, and close the slot, and we're ready to go. To remove the memory card, we open the door, push it out, and remove it, and then we can transfer files to our computer very easily. Next, let's talk about what kind of memory cards this can use, because they are not all the same. This is a 32 gigabyte SDHC memory card. This is the fastest and largest memory card this camera can take. It cannot take anything larger than 32 gigs. What you want to do when you look for a memory card is look for SDHC, that's key, 32 gigabytes. And if you have those two boxes checked when you get a memory card, it's going to work to the best of its ability with this camera. Anything larger, such as this SDXC, which is a faster memory card, 256 gigs, which is larger, is not going to work with this camera. Save your money, just buy an HC32 and you'll be very happy. For the record, a 32 gigabyte memory card on this camera will hold about 2,500 RAW files, so anything larger, even if it could take it, would just be a waste of space and money. Next thing we're going to talk about with this camera is how to use the flash. And there are two different ways to use the flash on the D80. The first is with the pop-up flash right here. All you have to do is push the button and it will pop up, and then when it fires, and then when we go over the mode dials, we'll talk about that a little bit more. The other option is to use, there we go, the flash hot shoe on top of the camera and mount a flash in the camera that way, okay? So there is one thing to note about flashes, and we're going to talk a little bit about basic flash technique. The worst possible place to put a flash is directly on top of the lens, pointing at your subject, okay? Why is that? Well, the reason is when you have your flash popped up or you use a flash mounted on the hot shoe pointing at your subject, the light leaves your flash, reaches your subject, bounces back towards your lens, and it's a very flat light and will give red eye if you're shooting a color photo to your human subjects. It's not a flattering look for anyone. Think about the way that we see people or anything all the time. If we're outside, the sun is above us. If we're indoors, overhead lights are above us. At night outside, street lights are above us. We see our world lit from above, and our brains are wired to see things that are lit from above as being natural and flattering. So if you replicate that with your flash use, you're going to have images that look better for your flash use subjects, okay? So a really easy way to do that. Now, modern Nikon flashes, I'm not a Nikon flash expert, but there are good guides online to figure out which ones work best with these cameras. Modern Nikon flashes will work, and most of them can at least tilt like this. If you can tilt your flash up, now you can bounce it off of a ceiling. In addition to tilting, some of them also have swiveling heads. So if you don't have a ceiling, you can tilt your head up a little bit, swivel it towards a wall, and now you can kind of replicate bounce light that will still be more flattering than directly onward. So flash use is one of those things that a lot of photographers will spend their entire career learning to master. There's a lot of nuance to it. The basic point for this video is that what you want to do with flash light is think about the way that we see light in a normal setting, and then use your flash to replicate that. So a couple notes about the flash, the way that it works on a technical basis, is that this has a 1/200th of a second flash sync speed. With a standard flash, that's the fastest shutter speed you can use with this camera. Whoa, what does that mean? Okay, so basically, let's say that there are high-speed sync flashes, and I believe some of them will work with this camera. Don't quote me on that. But we're going to talk a little bit about traditional flash use and technique here. With a traditional flash, the shutter curtain in this camera travels vertically, but it's hard for me to reach my hands to do that, so we're gonna pretend for this video that it travels side to side. With a traditional flash, when you press the shutter button, the first curtain opens, and then at 1/200th of a second, when this curtain finishes its travel, the flash triggers, the entire sensor is open to the light for about a 200th of a second, the second curtain closes, and then they reset like that, okay? Let's say that you wanted to use a flash sync at 1/50th of a second. Same thing, first curtain opens, flash fires, entire sensor is open to light for about a 50th of a second, curtain closes, reset. Okay, but what about 1/4000th of a second? First curtain starts, second curtain comes in right behind it, flash fires. When the first curtain finishes its travel, there's a little strip of illuminated sensor and darkness blocked by the second curtain here. Exposure finishes, reset. So the speed of your exposure isn't determined by how fast the shutter curtains move. They always move at the same speed. It's determined by the gap, the length of time between the first and the second curtain. At 1/200th of a second, that's the fastest shutter speed, where the first curtain is open and the entire sensor is exposed to light before the second curtain starts its travel. So that's the basics of how a standard flash works and why the flash sync speed is 1/200th of a second. Next up, let's talk about the mode dial on this camera here. And we're going to go through all of these different modes, and I'm going to tell you what they are. And if you have come to this camera because you want to learn more about photography, as a general statement, The modes you're going to use the most are P, S, A, and M, but we're going to talk about what all of these do so you understand what you're getting into with them. First is green camera. This is full automatic. You have no control over what the camera is going to do. You can't even pop up the flash. The camera is going to determine when the flash fires for you. All you can do is hold down the shutter button to autofocus, to have to press this to get autofocus, and then tell it when to take a picture. That's your control. Okay. If you have auto ISO, then the camera will also pick the ISO for you in addition to the shutter speed, aperture, and whether or not the flash pops up and fires. P stands for program mode, and in program mode you start to get a little bit of the control back. So what you're going to do is the camera will pick the shutter speed and aperture for you, but now you can determine whether or not the flash goes off, and you can also you'll be able to have some ISO control manually setting it, but you also have the ability, if you press the exposure value compensation button here, to force your camera to overexpose or underexpose up to 5 stops in each direction. You might be able to see that on the LCD screen right there. And what that's going to allow you to do is bracket your images or intentionally get low-key or high-key photos, things like that. You get the exposure value shifting in program mode. You do not have it in this mode, so you cannot do anything there. Okay. S stands for shutter priority. In shutter priority mode, you're going to pick the shutter speed right here. You can see as I adjust this wheel, I pick the shutter speed, and the camera will pick the aperture that's best based on your lighting conditions. Okay, and if it says, for instance, low, you don't have enough light to use the lens. This lens only opens up as far as f4 with the shutter speed and the ISO that you have selected. And you can also, again in this mode, force your camera to overexpose and underexpose. A stands for aperture priority, and in this mode you select the aperture, and then the camera will tell you the best shutter speed for your selected aperture. The shutter speed range on this camera is way larger than the aperture range, which means that you will likely never get an indicator with your shutter speed that you can't use it. You'd have to have your ISO set to something like 3200 and be using an f1.8 lens or something like that. But at any rate, with aperture priority, you select the aperture and the camera selects the shutter speed, and you can again force the camera to over or underexpose. M is manual. You select both the aperture and the shutter speed, and if they're right, great, the camera will give you a proper exposure. And if they're wrong, well, that's your fault, and the camera's going to do what you tell it to do. Either way, whether it's right or wrong. You can also tell the camera to give you a meter reading, which is too much or too little light. But basically, manual mode, you have full control over everything, and if the photos turned out well, it's because you did well, not because the camera was helping you. When we look at the viewfinder in just a minute, I'll also show you how to read the light meter and things like that in the viewfinder display. But and that will, some of what we're talking about here will make a little bit more sense when we look at the viewfinder layout. This next mode is called night portrait mode. Alright, so night portrait mode is for a specific setting, taking portraits at night. I know, they're not trying to hide any of this from you. So, with night portrait mode, what this is going to do is give you a longer exposure so that you can have, say, a friend sitting on a bench with a cityscape behind them. It will give you a long exposure to capture the lights of the city and then also trigger the flash to illuminate your friend. You can have the most successful use of this mode if you tell your friend not to move until after the photo's taken. You'll tell them when that is, of course, because if the flash triggers at the beginning of the photo and then they get up and leave and the photo goes on for like another few seconds, you'll have a photo of your friend sitting there illuminated with all the city lights that were behind them shining through them. Kind of a weird look. This next mode is called Night Cityscape, which is for taking photos of cities at night. So longer exposure, and I believe with that one, no flash. This mode is action, and this is going to work best with the longest end of your lenses zoom range here. It's going to use the largest aperture, the smallest f number possible to get the fastest shutter speed it can with the aim of freezing motion. So that's what action does. Close-up works best again with the longest end of your zoom, and what this is going to do is tell the camera to focus on something that is as close as it can possibly focus with your lens. So this is intended to be used for shooting something that is very close to your lens. Landscape mode works best when your lens is at the widest end of the zoom, and it's going to give you a small aperture for a deep depth of field. Landscape photos will work the best if you have something very close to the lens in the foreground, middle ground subject, and then just something distant like mountain range, right? So if you imagine some rocks, a lake, and then a mountain range, then landscape mode will work to have all of those be in focus. And lastly, we have portrait mode. This mode is designed to be used with the long end of your zoom range again, and what it wants to do is give you a depth of field which has a person subject in focus and then a blurry background. One of the things you can do to make this mode successful is have 9 to 10 feet of space at least between your person subject and the background, and that will help the camera make a nice blurry background behind your human subject. And then we're back to auto. If you have come to this camera because you want to learn how to take photos better because your cell phone wasn't giving you enough control, or you just want to improve with a more complicated camera, use auto and then P to really learn how the layout and handling work on this camera, and then switch into S, A, and M. Spend most of your time, I spend 95% of my digital photography time or so in aperture-priority mode. Almost 100% of my film photography is done manually anymore. And I almost never use shutter priority unless I'm specifically photographing something like a sporting event. But these modes up here will give you the most creative control, and also shutter priority and aperture priority will help make sure that your exposures turn out well. So in terms of learning how to do well with your photography, these modes in the silver with the silver surround are going to be the ones that are going to help you the most. Okay, next thing we're going to talk about are the meter modes, which are going to be over here. And I'm going to hold the meter button down, and it's the rear command wheel. I'm going to scroll through them, and you can see that there are 3 different symbols, okay? All blocks, center dot, and then center dot with parentheses. All block is 3D matrix metering 2. This metering mode uses the full RGB meter sensor, and with type G and type D lenses only, it can receive distance information from those lenses, as well as brightness and color information for proper metering of your scene. Dot in parentheses here is center weighted, and what this does is this is a center weighted 8mm area. In video 3 I'll show you how to change the size of that, by the way. And in center weighted, so in matrix the entire scene is used to calculate your exposure. In center weighted, a small area about the size of the circle in my fingers here is used to calculate the majority of your metering information, and then the balance of the scene is used to calculate a minority of it. I couldn't find the exact split for this camera. It's probably in the 70-30 range, best guess. And what that does is with center weighted metering, it's a fine standard use metering, but you can put, if you're taking a photo of a person, or let's say, put their face in the middle of the scene, use your auto exposure lock button, we'll see that in the 3rd video, to record and lock the exposure information. Compose the image as you want. You could even move the person off to the side to capture a background. And then you will have a photo which is exposed for the person's face, and then the rest of the image will take care of itself. So that's one of the ways to use center weighted metering. This last one is spot metering, and spot uses a very small area in the center of the frame for 100% of your metering information. I'm going to show you what that does right now. So when I start these videos, I have a gray card, and I record the exposure data with the gray card, so this should look pretty normal. This is an even gray, and nothing should change. And 100% of the metering information that you're on this video you're watching right now is coming from right in here on the gray card. But if we switch now to the white card, watch what happens to the background. It gets a bit darker, doesn't it? Yes, because now the camera is trying to make this white a gray color. Okay, so I'm going to make a real quick change here to my setup. There we go. And let's see what happens when I switch to black. Oh yeah, that gets unpalatably bright, doesn't it? So basically when the camera is trying to do here is turn this into gray. And you can see as I move my finger in and out of the metering area how that has an effect. So spot metering is an incredibly powerful type of metering, and what it does is use that 100% of your metering information to calculate your entire exposure. So again, put a person's face on that metering spot and you have metered for that person's face. Okay, you can also use it to say, here's a really dark area, here's a really light area, here's a really mid-tone area. Let's take 3 meter readings off of this scene manually and see if I can use that data to split the meter reading and come up with the best set, with a good metering myself. If this is 1/125th at f2, 1/125th at f16, 1/125th at f5.6, maybe trying a shutter speed at 1/125th at f5.6 in manual mode might be the best setting. So, and basically spot metering is a really good way to learn about how metering works, and if you want to play around with it, go for it. It's something that is very useful to learn. One thing about the spot metering on this camera that I forgot to mention, it's not just the center area of this, it's linked to your autofocus point. So you can use spot metering with autofocus on this camera, and let's say you're at a sporting event and you're photographing your kid's soccer game. Spot metering linked to your autofocus point. Get your kid in focus so that the focus is linked to them, and the photo will be properly exposed for your kid. All right, so I'm going to show you the drive modes now and explain what they all are. Here is single shooting mode, that's the symbol for it. With single shooting mode, what you do is you push the shutter button down and the camera will take a photo. You can hold the shutter button down and it will never take another photo, it will only take one. Anytime you want to take a photo, you have to press the shutter button. I'm going to push the drive mode button again, and now I have continuous. As long as I hold the shutter button down, the camera will continue to take photos until the memory card runs out, the buffer underruns, or I release the shutter button. This will take photos at a rate of 3 frames per second. If you're shooting RAW, you have 6 frames of buffer. If you're shooting JPEG, you have up to 100 frames of buffer. That's for a smaller size JPEG, by the way. So generally speaking, with cameras of this age, I recommend shooting RAW because you're going to be able to get the most out of them, but you'll have about 2 seconds of burst with this camera. Next up is self-timer. And what self-timer does is count down and beep at the same time. And after the countdown duration, which I believe we can set in video 3, it will take the photo. Next is self-timer with remote control. If you have a remote control, you can trigger this camera with the to start a self-timer countdown. And then the last one is remote control only. If you have the remote control, as soon as you press it, the camera will take a single photo, and now we're back to single frame. The last button to talk about on the top here is going to be the AF mode, and we can switch between 3 modes, AFA, AFC, and AFS. Okay? All you have to do is press it and it will scroll through them. AFA is automatic, and basically the camera will pick between AFS and AFC depending on what the scene requires. AFS, I think that's correct there, is that? Yeah. AFS is AF servo. What that means is that your camera will hone in, get focus, and take a photo. Once focus is locked, it will not shift focus even if your subject moves. AFC is AF continuous. Your camera will track moving subjects to follow them to obtain focus as they're moving. So AFS is good if you're taking portrait photos, like of a stationary object or doing a still life, something like that. AFC is good if you're at a sporting event, taking photos of your kids, your pets, something like that. I almost always leave my cameras in AFA because this is something that most cameras tend to pick out pretty well, whether or not a subject is moving, and the camera will do a pretty good job of selecting the best autofocus mode for your scene. So on the front of the camera, we have a few things that have different functions. This is the function button. We're going to punt this until video 3 because it has a function that's assigned by a menu item in video 3. And so when we talk about that, this is the button that applies. The depth of field preview button has the ability to stop down the lens. So this will let you kind of see what your depth of field is going to look like in your photo. So if we look down the lens and I push that, you can probably see that the aperture closes when I press it, just like that. On this side of the camera, we have the autofocus manual focus switch, which allows you to switch between autofocus and manual. So if you want to go into manual, you just simply flip this switch. When you are in autofocus, the camera will pick between AFA, AFS, AFC based on what you determined when you pressed the AF button up here, which we saw a few minutes ago. This is the bracketing button on this side. And if I push the bracketing button, now look at the LCD screen here, it will give you some information. So the way that the bracketing works is when you rotate the front command wheel, that will determine how much bracketing, and we'll talk about exactly what that means in a moment. It goes from a third of a stop up to 2 full stops in third stop increments. And then this will tell you how many photos it's going to take. 3, 0, 2, +2, or -2. So let's talk about what these are. 3 is 1 under, 1 proper, 1 over. 0 is bracketing is off. -2 is 1 under and 1 proper. +2 is 1 proper and 1 over. So those are your different bracketing settings. What does bracketing actually mean, though? Let's assume that a proper exposure is 1/125th of a second at f/5.6. If you are in program mode, the camera will adjust your images to over and underexpose as you've selected there automatically. So if you're doing 1 stop under, 1 proper exposure, and 1 stop over, it might do 1/250th, 1/125th, and then 1/60th as your 3 bracketing settings. Or it might adjust the shutter speed a half stop and the aperture a half stop in program mode. In shutter priority mode, the camera will adjust the aperture because you're setting the shutter speed. So it would do 1 under would be f8, proper exposure would be f/5.6, 1 over would be f4. In aperture priority, the camera will adjust the shutter speed because you're telling it what aperture to use. So basically, when you're bracketing, you're going to get a sequence of photos, one that has too little light, one that has the proper amount of light, and one that has too much light. So you will get better highlight detail with this one and better shadow detail with that one, and then good midtones in the middle. You can combine them if you want, or you can just use one of them. If you edit raw, you're going to have lots of flexibility with that process as well. And then your mode will determine which parameter between aperture and shutter speed are going to be controlled for that compensation. Also, with program mode, I believe just program mode on this, auto ISO allows it to adjust the ISO for that, and also flash compensation. If you're using a flash, I believe program mode can also adjust flash power to help with that as well. So, yeah, I think I have done so many of these Nikon DSLRs at this point that some of the functions kind of bleed together, and when different function sets were released throughout the life of these things. With bracketing, I'm going to show you a really neat trick. We're going to bracket here, and we're going to do 3 exposures that are 1 stop adjusted. So you'll have one that is a stop under, proper, a stop over. Next, I'm going to hit the EV comp button, and I'm going to shift this to -1. Now what we're going to get is one shot that's 2 stops under, one shot that's 1 stop under, and 1 stop that is a proper exposure. So if you know you don't need that really bright third exposure, you can EV shift to the darker side of the exposure spectrum while bracketing to hedge your bets that way. So you can EV shift with bracketing in combination to achieve different effects. You can also shift it to the overexposure. If you want to take a high key portrait photo of someone, you can start with normal over by using bracketing and exposure value compensation. Okay, next up I'm going to hit the flash button, which is this one right here, which pops up the flash, and then I'm going to hold the flash button, and you can see that up here I can intentionally dim the flash up to 3 stops, or I can even overclock it up to a full stop. I can add more light intentionally or reduce the flash output intentionally. So for instance, if you had a whole bunch of tabletop flashes that were triggered by a flash, you could do this with a dim flash here and have your secondary lights be triggered by it as a specific use for that. We'll go back to 0. And now I'm going to rotate the rear, and we can go through the different flash modes that are here on this. So the flash modes are normal, which is what you see right now, just a flash in the top right of the square. Normal and red eye reduction, which is a flash with an eyeball symbol. Normal, red eye reduction, and that should be slow curtain. It is. Slow sync, which means you get normal flash with the red eye reduction and at a longer shutter speed. Normal flash with a longer shutter speed, and normal flash with rear curtain sync. Those are the different ones. Let's talk about what they are. Normal is just standard flash operation. Your flash is going to trigger when the first curtain finishes its travel, and it's going to be normal power controlled with the metering option we select in video 3, so on and so forth. Standard flash use. Red eye reduction will pulse your flash before you take a photo so that your human subject's pupils will shrink and reduce the appearance of red eyes in them. With a slow curtain, now you're going to have a longer shutter speed. So if you're doing, this is basically night portrait mode right here, right? You're going to have a longer shutter speed so you can get a dark background into the image, as well as a red eye reducing flash. With normal flash and slow curtain, you get a longer shutter speed with a standard flash. So longer shutter speed is basically, could be like a 30th of a second. It doesn't mean it's going to be a 20-second exposure. And then rear sync is interesting. When I've talked so far about flash, I've said when the first curtain finishes its travel, the flash fires. Well, with rear sync, right before the second curtain starts its travel, the flash fires. Okay, so let's talk about that. Standard flash, first curtain, flash fires, second curtain, reset. Okay. Rear curtain sync, first curtain, flash fires, rear curtain, reset. At 1/200th of a second, rear curtain, first curtain doesn't matter. There's functionally no difference whatsoever. Oh, but at 10 seconds or 1 second or a half second, a longer exposure, now that does make a difference. In bulb mode, that makes a huge difference. Yes, you can use rear curtain sync in bulb mode, and what you can do with that is, let's say that you have somebody running through your frame holding a flashlight. Okay, it's really dark out, but they've got like a flashlight, and they're kind of pointing it at the camera that you're using. You push bulb, curtain opens, they have the flashlight, you release bulb, the flash fires, and now your friend over here with the flashlight's illuminated, and they have a line coming off of them to show how they ran. That's rear curtain sync. With front curtain sync, they would get here, you'd hit the flash, it would fire, and then the line would look like it was coming in front of them. So that's an example of how the two different front and rear curtain modes work. Gonna go right back to standard flash here, and there we go. Also, one other thing is that the manual indicates that the D80 has another mode called slow rear, and that's available in program and aperture priority modes only. However, I can't figure out how to get into it in this camera. I can't find a single option with this specific camera that has it. Insofar as I know, this has the current firmware. So I don't know if it's something that was taken out before the last version of the firmware, or if there's some secret setting that I haven't discovered on this camera that will trigger it. At any rate, it's supposed to exist. I can't find it, so we can't really talk about it because I can't demonstrate it or figure out how it works. Let's jump over here to the back of the camera and talk about what all of these different things are. The delete button, if you're playing back your photos, will let you delete photos. Playback will enter the playback menu so you can review the photos you've taken. Menu we'll get to in the next video. This enters the menu system. So the white balance button and the ISO balance button, and I believe also quality, yeah. We're going to push these buttons back here. We're going to go through them in this order, but we have to go back to the LCD to see what they actually do. On the LCD screen, I'm going to hit the white balance button, and it brings up my different white balance options, which we can scroll through right here. And you can also increase and decrease the power of the white balance option. So your white balance options are auto, tungsten, fluorescent, daylight, flash, cloudy, shaded, and Kelvin. And pre-record. Okay, so automatic is just automatic. The camera's going to look at the scene and give you the best white balance it can for what it thinks you need. The tungsten light is very orange, so the camera's going to add a lot of blue. If you have very, very, very orange lights like mercury vapor, you can increase this a lot. If you have less orange lights, like maybe a warm white fluorescent, you can decrease that a little bit. After tungsten, we have fluorescent. Fluorescents are green lights, and the camera's going to add a magenta to it to counter it. So if you have strongly fluorescent lights, you can add more magenta. And again, weakly fluorescent green lights, you can reduce the magenta. Next up, we have sunny. Yeah. And sun is a full spectrum of light, full spectrum of visible light. So the camera is going to balance the white balance in the camera for a full spectrum of light. Flash flash lights are xenon bulbs, and xenon creates a very blue light. So the camera will up the amount of amber in the light, in the color space rather, to counteract the blueness of the xenon bulb. Shade is a full spectrum of light that's been filtered through clouds, generally a bit cooler than is a full spectrum. So the camera is going to balance your color space for a slightly cooler full spectrum light. And then shaded, well, that was cloudy, but shaded rather, is in the shade of a building, also going to be a cooler full spectrum of light. This assumes you're outdoors. Kelvin allows you to adjust the Kelvin temperature specifically to give you control over the color. So 5000 is standard, like full spectrum light in a nutshell. But basically, when you come in here, the lower the number, the bluer the light's going to be. The higher the number, the warmer the light's going to be, the more amber. So this will allow you to manually adjust the color temperature between blue and amber of your images if you want to, say, specifically shoot images that have an amber tone to them so that it feels like you're shooting a Michael Bay video in California. And then the last one is what's called pre. Pre is a method we'll see, I believe, more in the third video. Usually that's the process for this is in the menu buttons, where let's say you have either a full room studio or a tabletop studio and you have a bunch of lights shining on this studio. You'd use a white backdrop or a white card in that studio space and take a photo of that image during the pre-record setting, and the camera will look at that white card. It will know this card is white, so what do I need to do with the lighting that's available to make that white look white? And then anytime you're in that studio space, you go back to your pre-recorded white balance, and all of your images will have the same color toning. What that does is make it very easy to balance your colors across a long shoot. If you had a white backdrop for a corporate portrait shoot and had 50 people, all of your photos would have the same white balance, which would make it a whole lot easier to get consistent images across that entire shoot. If you're selling things on Etsy or eBay or something like that, you could set up a white box for your tabletop studio, have the exact same white balance for all of the things that you're selling, and all of your images will look consistent across that whole batch. Back to auto. The ISO button down here. I'm going to hit this, and now I can adjust the ISO with the back command wheel from 100 up to high 1. Is that high 1? Yeah, high 1.0, which is 1600 here, 2000, 2500, 3200. Should be the way that works. I don't know why they don't just use numbers. They should just, it's easier. Anyway, and then to an ISO as slow as 100. And then quality, I can come in here and I can switch between the image quality. So this right here is just RAW. The camera is only going to record a RAW photo. If you're using any version of Windows from 7 and later, please don't be using version 7 still, but 10 or 11 are fine here in 2024. Basically, you don't need to shoot anything but RAW if you want to shoot RAW photos. All of the later Windows versions, and I assume the same is true for Mac, will give thumbnail displays of your RAW photos, or thumbnail previews of your RAW photos in your File Explorer view. So back in the day, you could shoot RAW plus a JPEG of some size, because older Windows versions like before 7 couldn't display a thumbnail of RAW files. So that would allow the JPEG next to the RAW file to be the thumbnail of the RAW file. You don't need to do that anymore, just shoot RAW. Now we go into the JPEG modes. And your JPEG options are fine, large, normal large, and basic large. And then you can adjust the size from large to medium to small with the front command wheel like this. So basically, if you needed to shoot 20,000 photos on your memory card, you could switch to JPEG and do something like a basic small and probably shoot 20 to 25,000 photos and get that full 100 JPEG buffer. This would have been for somebody like a photojournalist, where image resolution isn't as important for printing in something like a newsprint, because newsprint resolution is very low. But if you're here and you want to get the most out of your images, just shoot straight RAW and edit in post, and that way you'll get the most image data from your files and you'll have the most editing flexibility. Now the last few buttons we have to look at, the screen here is only used for the menu. We're going to see that in the next video. We'll talk about the functions of this in the next video as well. The crosspad we're going to use for navigating the menus in the next video. This autofocus lock switch will lock the autofocus point so that you can't accidentally swap it. This is really good if you select, say, a specific autofocus point over to the side and you're in portrait orientation and you're taking a corporate portrait photo shoot and you want the bridge of everyone's nose to be on the same autofocus point and in focus. This will prevent the autofocus point from being shifted and will help you with consistent focus placement. And then the OK button right here just confirms things that you've done, and then this light will light up when a photo is being written to the SD card. And if this light is on, do not remove the SD card, you will mess things up. Having gone through all of that different stuff now, let's talk about how to take a photo with the camera. The idea behind this camera is that you will dial in all of your settings ahead of time. Your mode, your meter setting, your autofocus, your drive mode, all of your settings will be dialed in ahead of time, and then when you go to take a photo, you just hold down the shutter button and take a photo. That way you don't miss a photo because the camera's still waiting for some information. So what you're going to do with this is just make sure that when you go to take a photo, everything is pre-configured and that you're ready to go. And that's it. It's very simple. Let's talk a little bit about what's in the viewfinder. This is what you're going to see. This is just taken out of the manual. I just literally print screened it. Normally I redo these from scratch, but this was a lot to do, so I just didn't. Anyway, when you're in the viewfinder, looking through the optical viewfinder, this is the maximum that you could see. This is your viewfinder area where the image is going to be created. What you can see here are your grid lines. If you turn the grid line on and off, we'll talk about that in the third video. These here are your autofocus points, and these will light up to let you know which autofocus point is being activated when you take a photo. This circle that you can kind of see with these lines is your 8% or 8mm rather, center weighted metering area. We'll talk about how to change this in the third video. I don't think that the actual circle size changes. This is your SD card warning. If this is lit up, there's no SD card in your camera, and you can activate and deactivate this in the menu settings. We'll talk about that in the third video. BW indicates you're in black and white photography. Battery indicates your battery is getting low. Down here, that circle indicates focus confirmation. Something will be in focus in your image. Flash L indicates that you're going to be using, I think, low flash compensation. ISO auto indicates that your auto ISO is enabled. AEL indicates that your auto exposure lock is enabled, and we'll talk about how to set that up in the third video. This is your shutter time right here. This is your aperture over here. This is your light meter reading, or light meter readout. So this is, generally speaking, if you're shooting in any mode other than manual, you will usually have this line under the 0 illuminated, indicating a proper exposure. If you intentionally overexpose or underexpose, then a different line will be lit up. If you're in manual mode and you have a line over here that's lit up, that means you're giving the camera too much light. You'll have an overexposed image, and you have to adjust your settings to get that line back to 0 over here. Opposite is true for this direction for the minus, okay? These dots above the lines indicate bracketing. So if you are going to bracket your photos, these will be illuminated to indicate that bracketing is going to be activated and by how much. Low battery warning. Interestingly, it's in two places. I don't know why. White balance bracket indicates that white balance bracketing is on. If the white balance is not illuminated, it just indicates bracketing is on. This symbol indicates that flash compensation is on. Your flash will either overclock or underclock to provide too much or too little light versus a proper exposure. Next to it is a symbol that indicates exposure value compensation is on. You will either have too much light or too little through shutter speed and aperture combinations. Remaining photos. K indicates that more than 1,000 photos remain, and this is your flash symbol and indicates that the flash will fire when you take a photo. And that is the Nikon D80's operations in this, except for the menu. And in the next video, we're going to go through every single menu item and talk about how to configure this camera to specifically meet your needs. See you in the next video. Hey everyone, if that video was helpful, check out this other video that might be helpful too.